Canon's mirrorless camera lineup is confusing, convoluted, and frustrating. Sorry, I didn't mean to come in super hot with that opinion. My name's Matt, welcome back to the channel. We learn to talk about photography till we're sick of it, and today I'm finally gonna get some stuff off my chest about Canon cameras. You figured that out. So a few years ago, and like a decade after most camera manufacturers had begun to migrate their technologies toward mirrorless cameras, Canon finally decided to dip their toes in the water and signal that they were interested in developing a full-frame mirrorless camera with the introduction of this model, the Canon EOS R. This is a bunch of DSLR parts shoehorned into a minimalist body with a controversial and experimental control structure that thankfully died with this camera, a new RF mount, and the vague promise that maybe eventually one day Canon would develop a fully featured full-frame mirrorless camera because, I don't know, they've been really busy for the last 10 years or something. But thankfully they did make good on that promise when recently they released the Canon EOS R6. This camera's got IBIS, full-frame 4K video in 10-bit, dual card slots, full weather sealing, a fast burst rate, and a great intelligent tracking autofocus system, all the key tenets of what we think of as a mirrorless camera. But one specification that's really confounded me, and as a landscape photographer makes it difficult for me to consider this as a serious upgrade from the EOS R, is that it's got a lower resolution sensor, and in fact considerably lower resolution. This has got a 20 megapixel sensor, where the original EOS R has got the 30 megapixel sensor from the 5D Mark IV DSLR. And acknowledging that resolution isn't everything, and I do agree that it can become blown out of proportion, I can't remember the last time that I looked at a large print that I made of a landscape and thought, well, it would be great if this just had less resolution. In fact, the opposite is very often the case. But I thought it would be worth testing those assumptions by bringing both these cameras out into the woods to take some test shots, both to see how they respond to different adjustments in the computer, but also how those different resolutions are reflected in screen and print presentations. So, EOS R versus EOS R6 for landscapes, let's go. Okay, the first test I'm going to conduct today is a high ISO speed comparison between the two cameras. I work at high ISO speeds in the landscape for generally one of two reasons. The second one I'll get back to after we do these test shots, but the first and most frequent one is when there's a lot of subject motion. So for example, when there's a lot of foliage in the scene and there's a breeze blowing through, I'll have to get the shutter speed up to freeze that subject so that it doesn't become blurry in the final photograph. And in order to do that, especially in lower light situations like working here in the deep woods, I'll have to use higher ISOs. So I've got the EOS R up first to bat. We're going to do tests at 3200 and 6400 ISO, and then we'll swap over to the R6 and see if its years of technological improvements can help it manage an advantage in high ISO speed. As I mentioned, there's another situation where I often find that I'm shooting at higher ISO speeds when I'm out shooting in the landscape. And that's when things are going off so quickly, right? Sudden light conditions, sudden weather conditions, something that I've got to catch instantly that I don't have time to set up my tripod, and so I'm trying to counteract camera shake. And so I'm interested in seeing if the R6's image stabilization offers an advantage on that. So I'm going to shoot both of these cameras off working at longer and longer shutter speeds and lower ISOs to see how low the ISOs can get between the two cameras shooting the same scene with the same lens under the same situations. I love the sound of the river whooshing by. It is so good for the spirit. If whooshing is a proper onomatopoeia, I'm not sure. I've come down to the riverbanks to conduct the final simple test to compare the dynamic range differences between the cameras, how well they handle recovering information in the highlights and in the shadows, how sensitive the sensors are to those extremes in the imaging process. So here at the riverbank, I've got a really bright sky, a bright reflection, and then these gorgeous trees in this scene leaning out towards the river in complete shadow. So lots of dynamics at play in the scene. And I'll take this at an underexposure, a neutral exposure, and an overexposure on a two-stop axis. And then we'll pull them back into the computer in the studio and see how the files react to some basic exposure manipulations in Lightroom. And then, I think, of most interest to me, we'll run them through the printer and see which ones give us the best result at different print sizes. I have our test print here. If you thought that I was going to make full-size test prints of these photos, you have no understanding of my finances. But I'll explain what we're looking at here in just a second. First, I want to make some notes about cameras that I used during the testing. I want to thank my friend Michael for lending me his Canon EOS R6 for the test. I'll be sure to leave a link to his social media down in the video description so you can see what he's creating with it. The Canon EOS R is my camera to give you some sense of my biases. I've been using it for a few years and I bought it with my own money. There is another full-frame Canon camera called the Canon EOS RP that is situated even lower in price than the ones that I used in testing. It's got a really poor battery life and it's not weather sealed, so that could limit it from some landscape situations, but the actual reason I didn't include it in the testing was I couldn't get my hands on one. So that camera is generally not reviewed particularly favorably, but you know, for $1,000 it could be the right camera for someone out there, and I'll be sure to leave some information down in the video description if you'd like to do some more research on the EOS RP and sort of get a sense of where that's situated in the lineup of cameras that I was able to test. And lastly, I'm going to tell you that there is a new Canon mirrorless camera with a 33 megapixel sensor and most of the high-tech features found in the Canon EOS R6. In some cases, more features. Of course, I'm talking about the EOS R7, the camera that I've been featuring throughout the month on the channel, testing it in lots of different scenarios. But in order to do an apples-to-apples comparison with these cameras, I would have had to do test shots of all the different situations that I tested today with the R7. So of course I did that. But because the R7 has had such a prominent feature on the channel, I wanted to make a dedicated video to that. So be sure you're subscribed if you'd like to see how the imaging performance of the R7 stacks up against the EOS R and the EOS R6, as well as some other special shooting scenarios. I'm going to put the R7 to as a landscape camera to try it out. In terms of the two cameras that you did see me test today, the R and the R6, we started out with a high ISO test, which the R6 creamed with flying colors. Is that a mixed metaphor? I was really impressed with the ISO performance of the R6, and we're going to see some examples where the R generally leads the R6 in terms of resolution, right? That's no huge surprise that 30 versus 20 megapixels. But I would say above 1600 ISO, that difference is completely negated. The R6 is much better at retaining detail at higher ISOs, and I would say in pretty much any print size or application, if you're shooting at high ISOs, the R6 is your camera all day. The handheld stabilization test is a little bit of a different story and not quite what I expected. All I can really say is that I wasn't able to show an appreciable difference between the two cameras. I was using an EF lens, so perhaps the R6 would give a better result using an RF lens. But in terms of the test that I conducted today with the equipment that I used, neither camera really produced a great result below like 0.6 of a second. So I would say it's a wash. In terms of dynamic range, however, it was a clear advantage for the R6. Better at highlight recovery and much cleaner in the shadow recovery. For the test prints that I made, we're looking at the 1/30th of a second exposure with no exposure adjustments made, no extra sharpening, no extra noise reduction. But just before we look at the prints, I want to touch briefly on screen presentation because I know that's not something that I'll be able to meaningfully convey in a YouTube video. There's a clear difference between the R and the R6 looking at them on the screen. I don't know if I would say a dramatic difference, but it's an appreciable difference in resolution between the two cameras. So for me, that resolution difference is something that I appreciate when I'm showing off my work in YouTube videos or in other video platforms where I want to crop in and pan around right on the photos. So you guys follow my channel, you know that I do that, you know that that's a use case that's important to me, but I think it's something that more photographers should be looking towards, featuring their photos in video formats where cropping is going to be more and more important. The other thing that I think is worth touching on for screen presentation is a lot of times we will enlarge photos and look at them on the screen where the noise is more prominent, the edge sharpness and the fine details are maybe a little more washed out in digital artifacts, and people will say, well, you're pixel peeping at that point. When would you ever realistically look at a photo in one-to-one reproduction? And what's worth keeping in mind is that with a 20 megapixel file, if you're presenting that as, say, as a desktop wallpaper on a 5K screen, right, like an iMac, 20 megapixels is just a hair over 5K resolution. So, so in that scenario, you're basically always looking at your image in one-to-one reproduction with very little downscaling. So just a little thought into screen presentation and, you know, where you're going to start bumping into resolution limitations working with 20 megapixel files. Okay, we'll look at these prints now. So yeah, no, I didn't make like 20 by 30 or 40 by 60 prints of the test photos that I made. This is a crop of what would be a 20 by 30 print and a 40 by 60 print. So we'll try to get a close look at these here. The EOS R is this on the left. The R6 is this one on the right. For the 20 by 30 size, I can see that the R is sharper, right? And hopefully that comes across here in this video, but it's not like night and day. I would say that if you were gonna make a 20 by 30 from a 20 megapixel file, you probably could get away with it. You would notice the sharpness difference if you were looking at these two results side by side. But if you just looked at the 20 megapixel file enlarged to a 20 inch by 30 inch print, you'd probably be satisfied with it, especially with some viewing distance. The 30 inch by 60 inch is where things really changed for me. Again, this is the EOS R on the left, the 30 megapixel file, and the 20 megapixel file of the R6 on the right. And here I can see a dramatic difference in detail between these two. And in fact, the R6 to me looks like the kind of cheap enlargement that a person would get from like the photo machine at the drugstore, right? That little like Kodak or Fuji photo machine. That's what this print looks like to me. But the EOS R's 30 megapixel print looks okay, but still not great. I think you would see the benefit of 50 to 60 megapixels here. But the 30 megapixel file, I think, would do the job. The 20 megapixel file, I would not consider selling or displaying this in an art gallery, for example. Right, so how often do I make enlargements this big? Personally, myself, honestly, never. But I'm constantly finding that I'm putting my back catalog to uses that 2 or 3 years ago, I never would have thought that I would put it to. So, so this is somewhat a process about what can I do with my photos today, but also somewhat about how can I eliminate limitations to what I can do with my photos in the future. And hopefully, if you're considering purchasing one of these cameras, this video has been helpful to you. If you appreciate my advice, I've got affiliate links down below that you can use to purchase the cameras. You can toss me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/MattRamsey if you enjoyed the conversation or you found the advice useful. Next week, we've got a video coming up about the R7 in the landscape, so be sure you're subscribed if you like to see that. And until I see you next time, you guys keep an eye out and a foot forward, and thank you for watching.